So we're going to first have Ruba. My order was wrong in my head. Ruba is currently curator at Sculpture Center in New York City, where she's produced a range of group shows and also solo projects. A lot of it is commission-based, but the group shows include the Eccentrics, Puddle, Pothole, Portal, co-curated with the artist Camille Andro. Would be great to also hear what that experience was like. Better Homes, Disagreeable Object, and recent solos that include working with Sam Anderson, Teresa Burga, Charlotte Porcher, and among others, CATPC, Cosima von Bonnen, Jumana Mana, among others. Katrib is also writing for a number of museum catalogs and periodicals, such as Art in America, Art Forum, Kura Magazine, Kaleidoscope, among others. And she is also, what I'm quite interested in is the kind of formats for conferences and discursive forums that Ruba has been part of in different institutions that she has worked in within the United States, across the United States, in fact, from Chicago to Miami to New York City, where she currently is. Further, she's also participated within panels on indigenous issues in contemporary art and on the Syrian collective Abu Nadara, both either at the Vera List Center for Art and Politics at the New School. So this again seems part of this dialogical approach to practice and maintaining that with other organizations. And she's also served as a research companion for the next Carnegie International 2018, conducting travel and research in the Caucasus region. We also talked about her interest in South Asia, and I hope that that features in some way within your practice now or in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha. So can we do the first, Mohar, could we do this, not this one, the other one. Okay, thanks everyone for coming today, and I'd like to thank everyone at Experimenter for the opportunity to speak here and come to Kolkata today. And I'm really thrilled to be part of this esteemed group of curators presenting their practices, and it's been really wonderful to hear all the presentations so far, and I'm looking forward to our group conversation. So I'm going to kind of try and do it all and see what I can convey to you. I'm going to discuss three, Mohar, if you don't mind just like slowly going through this presentation, like as yeah, thank you. So I'm going to discuss three exhibitions that I've curated in the last few years, but before I get to that, I just wanted to like quickly breeze through these images of some of the shows I've organized at Sculpture Center since I began working there in 2012, just to give you an idea of some of the shows I've done. And while I've been there, I've planned and organized several group shows, solo exhibitions, public programs. I've worked with artists from around the world and have provided them with opportunities and crucial moments in their career. So that's something I really focus on and consider is like, you know, what is the occasion of the exhibition? Like, why are we doing it? What is the artist getting? What is the public getting? What is the institution getting? And you know, I also do a lot of commissions. So I work with artists to develop new work. So at Sculpture Center, it's a very unique space, which does tend to engender new commissions. Artists always want to do something new. Usually in the building, group shows are a little different. There's usually a mix. But and prior to working at Sculpture Center, I used to work at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Miami, which was a whole other context. And it was a similar type of structure in which I was also commissioning new work and doing solo and group exhibitions. So I've been doing this for a little over 10 years. And these types of shows, prior to that, I was in Chicago, where I started a residency space called Three Walls, which is still kind of going. It's sort of falling apart right now, but that was running since 2002. So it was a really important part of the Chicago art scene. I was involved for just a few years in the beginning. I think, you know, I sort of take a stand in my curatorial work. I would describe my practice as feminist, and I also acknowledge the multifold inequities within the cultural sphere, within contemporary art, and I don't really ignore them and hope that they'll go away. There's something I really address within my practice, maybe not directly, but it's always there. And of course, recognizing that I have my own shortcomings and blind spots within that as well. So working within the context of the United States and New York City, I have to be responsive to the local art scene, but I also work to introduce artists and ideas considering their framing within New York City, their reception in a place that's very international, but it's also really provincial. So this is Radimus Uni Figueroa, an artist from Puerto Rico, which is a territory of the United States, and that was also a really important exhibition to do in New York. And so, at Sculpture Center, we're in Long Island City, Queens, so we're just a 10-minute, 5-minute subway ride from Midtown Manhattan. We're very, it's somewhat central, but it's also a destination. We're a smallish, mid-sized organization, which is really important. In the United States, there aren't so many mid-scale institutions anymore. It's huge mega museums, increasingly expanding, and then there are these small, more nimble spaces. So we're something in between. We do professional exhibitions, we produce work, we give artists opportunities, we have a professional staff, but we're also quick and nimble. We don't have a ton of overhead and bureaucracy. So it's a really nice type of institution. It's called Sculpture Center, but it's not just sculpture. Of course, sculpture is defined by artists, and artists do not tend to stick to these organized mediums. So that's something we acknowledge. I mean, definitely we have visitors who come and are upset that there aren't marble busts on view, but that's quite rare. So right now, I have 3 shows on. We can go a little faster. Thank you. Sorry. I just want to this is just a little teaser. This is a show, Puddle, Pothole, Portal, that I co-curated with artist Camille Unroe in 2014. I'm actually working on a future show that I'm co-curating with an artist, Lawrence Abu Hamdan. But this, it's an interesting experience to co-curate with an artist, coming up with a lot of different perspectives and ideas, and also really learning what does it mean to be a curator, because often artists don't know intimately what goes into making a show, and there's things I take for granted that I have to start explaining, and it's very interesting to do that. Why do we have to do it like this? Why is this important? So it gets you out of your habitual thinking. So yeah, we can, sorry, can we go even faster? Oh yeah, Arya Rasmussen-Suk, this is a show, her first survey in the United States of a Thai artist, super important. A lot of video work, but also working with sculpture, thinking about psychic space. So that's a sort of expanded idea of sculpture. And right now there's 3 solo shows that I have on at Sculpture Center. So oftentimes I'm doing multiple shows at once, from 1 to 3. And we change over the entire building 3 times a year. So right now it's Teresa Berga and Charlotte Progr and Sam Anderson. So Teresa Berga is an artist from Peru in her 80s, who's really getting a lot of recognition, overdue recognition in the last few years. And this is her first institutional survey show outside of South America. There was one in Argentina previously, and now she's being bought. Her work's being bought by a lot of big museums and put into their collections, into the Latin American sections often. But it was kind of important that she have a show. So that was something I really felt was urgent. And she was actually in the Puddle, Pothole, Portal exhibition I did a few years ago now. So bringing her back. So often artists return in the program from a group show. Anthea Hamilton's a great example, who was in another group show I did, then had a solo show, and this exhibition got her nominated for the Turner Prize. A British artist, young, hadn't really had any shows in the US at all. So, and yeah, Sam Anderson is who has a show on now, like Rochelle Goldberg, or younger New York-based artists who are having their first institutional solo show, really testing out their ideas, filling a large space, thinking through their work, commissioning new work for the exhibition, and oftentimes many opportunities come out of that, where they're then in group shows at the Whitney Museum, et cetera, and biennials. We can go super fast through this one, because I'm going to talk about it in just a minute. And the other show I have on right now is Charlotte Progr, who is an artist based in Glasgow, and she's a mid-career artist, and this was her first show in the US as well. So this is Aki Sasamoto, who's a Japanese artist who lives in New York, solo show in the lower level, performance space. We can kind of skip this one because I'm talking about this in a minute too. Sorry, I wanted to like put it all together and then separate it out. So this is the show that's on now. Sam Anderson, who's the New York-based artist, first institutional show, solo show. Again, really important for the community to see a colleague of theirs like have an exhibition. What can she do? They've seen her work in apartment shows, group shows. You know, Charlotte introducing an artist that people are, you know, a fan of but haven't really seen her work, exposing it to wider audiences. And this is Teresa Burga. So she was working with like, she was one of the first pop artists really in Lima where she was based, and she has a very complex practice, and she continued it through the dictatorship in Peru, but you know, outside of a community. She had a community. She was part of a group in the 60s, and then it splintered off, and she kept working, and she still works. So this show, this is the oldest work in the show, 1967, and then there's a work from January 2017. So she's still very active with her drawings. So we can go to the next presentation. So the first, I'm going to talk about 3 shows quickly. I think I'll talk about Gabrielle super quick. I just want to show you the building of Sculpture Center. So you can see it. It's an old trolley shop that was built in the early 1900s. It was renovated in 2000 or so to become an exhibition space. And you renovated again in 2014 with this new lobby. So in a neighborhood that's quickly changing, there's like so many high-rise constructions going up, new condos being built, some amenities starting to arrive. So it's really, it's like the Miami of New York. So Gabriel Sierra, I'll talk about this quite fast, but I just wanted to discuss a solo show for a second. He's an artist based in Bogota, and this was again his first show in New York, in an institution, and he's really responsive to space. So I've been showing you images of our main floor and our lower level. Our lower level, you may notice, is this arched corridor. It's a basement. It looks very, it's very specific. So artists really need to take it on. So he broke down the space through time, architecture. Sorry, Mohar, can we go back a few? Now we're going to go slower. Thank you. Sorry. So this is, and one more, or 2 more. Yeah, this one. So you can see this work. This is in the entrance. This work, everything was built on site. The show is almost invisible in some way, but this wall opens and closes. So on Mondays, it was closed. So Monday, you had to go down another entrance to enter the exhibition. The rest of the week, it was open, so you can see it's open, and you walk through it. And so he really redirected the movement of this space. And then next few ones. This is an arched corridor. He built these forms within the space that totally disoriented the viewer walking through. You thought you were making left turns, right turns, left turns. You didn't really know where you were at the end. And for me, even for me who knows the space so well, I was always like confused going through this. So that was quite exciting. The next work, this just looks empty. But there's this exit sign that we built a specific motor. We had to consult several mechanical engineers to construct this. It's an exit sign that just slowly moved down the corridor. So you would walk in and you just, could sort of maybe notice it. Some people did not notice it, but the show is always changing every time you walk through. So the placement of works would move. If we move forward, this work was the keyboard alphabet it was a projection on this little metallic sign. So when you're in the space, you couldn't really tell that it was a projection. It just looked like a sign. But it slowly would rotate through the letters. So let's say you walk through, it was Y. You came back around, it would be Z. So you would just sort of always have a different experience on a very subtle level. So he really unpeels the space, unpeels the conventions of the institution, like closing a work on one day of the week, pointing to these conventions of how we deal with space. this is a projection on, another projection onto sign in this dark room that actually looked like this reflective street sign, and of course was not. It was just like an illusion. So then again, another sign, the numbers, the next one is another number, and then the next one, this is a room that's normally closed, and then he just opened it. The door was a work, and then this sign was placed in it, which is, you know, playing off the sort of the legal language of occupancy within spaces in New York. So this show I'll talk about a little bit more. This is the Eccentrics, one of the several group shows I've curated. So that, sorry, this image is bad, but I thought I removed that. But this is, I think this is the old PowerPoint, but it's okay. We'll be fine. So this is the Eccentrics. It was a group show I curated with a number of artists, international, and it was based in some part on this manifesto, this group of artists in Russia who took their name from the eccentric, which is a Russian term for these avant-garde circus performers. So this was research that came out of the 2014 show Puddle, Pothole, Portal, which was really looking at second industrial revolution entertainment and responses to new technologies. And this is something that I continuously look at in some of these shows, which is the relationship to third industrial revolution of new technology that we're dealing with now, and looking at parallels. So the Eccentrics, you know, so I've looked at early 20th century animation, cartoons. That was for Puddle, Pothole, Portal, slapstick, ideas of humor in relation to machines, things going wrong. And then through the research for Puddle, I came across this quote by Walter Benjamin about the eccentric actor, and this is like the precursor for Charlie Chaplin, you know, who he names, but also people like Buster Keaton, and this idea of like this absurd reality, you know, twist on reality, and a way of like dealing with the sort of constraints and new potentials as well of technology. So looking at parallels to now, the circus became a really interesting thing to examine. It's really out, I mean, the circus is gone. You know, this is a really like a specific moment of entertainment, and that relates specifically to audience relationships. So I was thinking about that as a parallel to the contemporary art exhibition, this relationship, this idea of like special effects, tricks, and the circus is a place where this was happening through analog means, but then now we have new technologies that are doing this through digital means. But this possibility of seeing something happen in real time and space that seems like unbelievable, but then you believe in it, it's like it's a real thing, it's happening right in front of you, and it warrants this reaction. I actually went to the circus as part of the research, you know, one of the last circuses, and there's a bunch of kids, and they were like screaming and shocked and laughing. You know, the woman with tons of hula hoops on her, they couldn't believe it. You know, it's like this whole thing. It's still mesmerizing. It's still this space of fantasy, but it's also real. So this was something that I was really interested in with art, because we go into exhibitions as like a circus ring, where there's all these specific acts that are happening, each one kind of contained, but they come together to create a larger effect. So it takes you through an arc of experiences, and that there's sort of this reaction by the audience. We also take these things on face value. We believe them, even though we know they're not real outside of this space. So there's sort of this investment in idea. So things that historically were interesting of the circus. So the circus was formalized during the Victorian era, you know, and it evolved through industrialization. It comes out of ancient Roman ritual, street performances, esoteric knowledge. It turns danger into entertainment, wild animals into performers, and gravity into an illusion. So, you know, fire eaters and lion tamers have transfixed audiences from ancient Rome to the present. So that became really interesting. Okay, so so it's ancient. There's no distinct storyline that's like super clear narrative, but it's moving. It's this sort of like it is sort of this anti-narrative that I find really interesting. And the ringleader could be like the curator, I guess. But you know, taking people through these different humor, fear, apprehension, amazement, there's these different qualities that are taken through. So And I was also interested in this group that were using the circus through through avant-garde art modes, film primarily, but also performance and visual art. A lot of they were also inspired by Meyerhold, Vesivold Meyerhold, who's a film director, a theater director, and Serge Eisenstein, who's been very important for a lot of my research, who's a film director and critic, looking at speed and technology. But we can keep going through the picture. So this is the show. It had many like artists that made new work, some existing. Several of the artists had performances, so the performance program was really important to the show. It wasn't like artists were performing on top of it. It was like integrated. The space was set up for performance, so the seating arrangement, well, this work by Adriana Lara was new. It's a frog that breathes. So it had a mechanical function. It was slowly breathing. So it was just like, or maybe dying, a dying breath. And this is an endangered frog species. The seating arrangement I introduced into the show, and it was used for the performances. So you have this feeling of like being able to wait for something to happen. This is a work by Eduardo Navarro, who a failed successful work that you were supposed to put this helmet on and then you could see time go backwards, but instead it just became a symbolic gesture because it didn't really work. We can move through the rest of them quickly. So a film by Zhou Tao. This is Georgia Sagri, who took these images from the newspaper Recent News and projected them on these overhead projectors. And then when we get to the film performance program, which is next, this is Tori Ranes, who did a performance on the opening night. And she was on, what are they called? I can't remember those gliders. Eva Mitiskovice, who's performing with her installation. So Georgia's performance, she took these items from daily news and then reenacted them through these gestures that reinvested a sort of like emotional pertinence to them, urgency. So she made them very like emotionally pertinent, if you know her work. And then the next show I wanted to talk about is a complicated show. And so this exhibition of the, which I'll just call CATPC for short, but the Congolese Plantation Workers Art League. So this is an exhibition of sculptures. So we can stop at one of these installation shots for a second. But these are chocolate sculptures made by plantation workers in the Congo, in Lusanga, which is former Libreville, which in 1911 was the Libreville Plantation. So this is the Unilever company that we have now, that it's turned into, which funds also the Tate Unilever series. So it's embedded in the art world as a funding structure. But this show really looks at, I'm going to try and get it all in a clear way, but definitely ask me questions because there's always some central bit of information that is missing. But so they're sculptures made in the Congo, in Lusanga, out of mud. They're 3D photographed. Molds are printed. They're produced in the Netherlands, where they're cast in Berry Callebaut chocolate, which is a Belgian chocolate, of course. You know, Congo was a colony of Belgium for a horrific period of time, and they still have relationships with the Congo and a presence there. So this is a important gesture that this chocolate is from Belgium, but also the plantation workers harvest cacao and palm oil, so that they have experience with this material, not as something they eat, but as seeds that they're collecting. So they make these objects. They're made out of mud, so they can't leave the Congo. They can't leave Lusanga. It's very difficult to get things in and out. So now they can circulate. They're made in addition. So in the exhibition, I decided to have several versions of each one because they're charged with different narrative powers that the artists have decided they want to circulate in the world where they cannot go. They don't have money or visas to leave. So this is their way out. in some way. So for this show is quite special. And there's some, of course, Europeans who are involved in helping make this happen, notably Renzo Martins, who is a Dutch artist, as well as collaborators in the Congo like René Ngogo, who's an environmental and political activist in the Congo. He's involved in this as well. So they set up a center in the Congo where artists are brought into this, plantation workers are brought in as artists. They have to have some sort of artistic skill, interest, desire to do this. They're making the sculptures, they're making now drawings, they made a video for this collective activities, but also each sculpture is individually authored. And they're sold, and then the profits go back to CATPC. So they get to have this money, and I don't know, I think this one doesn't have the slide, but they buy things with them. They collectively decide what they want to get. If they're getting tools, they're getting plants, they're planting banana trees, they're getting the tools they need to do this. They're gaining capital to invest in their community. And also part of this plan is this more like PR relations, like let's get this message across, let's turn this place into a destination, let's play with the structure of contemporary art and how it circulates in the market. So they've actually just built a part plantation, part garden, part research center, part white cube in the Congo that now is an active center. So for this show, we applied for a visa for one of the artists, Mathieu Kayasama, who makes $200 a year. He's a young man. I think he's like 27 years old. We didn't have so many. We went through this whole process. We didn't really think that it was going to be possible, but we had to give it our best effort. It cost about $3,000 to do this. We had to get him a birth certificate first, then the passport, then the visa. We had a pro bono lawyer helping us do this. And miraculously, he came. He arrived the day of the travel ban that Trump instituted. So, this show opened. I was planning it, and it was leading up, and it opened right after the inauguration. We actually had to move the opening date a week later because we actually had planned it for the inauguration a while ago without thinking. But so it was a very, needless to say, sort of emotional, intense show because the plantation becomes like a model for understanding global inequities and how we're all funded and sponsored by exploitation. So this exploitation is key, at least in the United States, for how art is developed, culture is developed, society is developed, wealth is developed, and it's very pertinent for the art world. And I wanted this show to come to New York because it's a place where people are talking about gentrification, what are artists doing, art market. There's a lot of issues that are coming up, and this exhibition really speaks to them, but from a completely different angle, and evokes a lot of, sort of points to a lot of the sources of these issues that we're facing right now that are still contemporary. There's still, the enslavement of the Congolese people through, villagers, at least through this plantation structure, which continues to this day. So Mathieu came. He was super excited. He'd never seen the work in exhibition. He was, he's a charismatic person. He was, he'd never been on a plane before. I mean, it was like someone came with him. And it really challenged us and it challenged me because it was I really had to think about what it means to bring this person to New York to participate in this exhibition. So we can go forward. We organized, these are some of their drawings that are showing these different systems of okay. I'll just say one thing very quickly. So we can go up further. There's an image here of everyone. These are all the members of a year ago. There's not that many women, of course, but slowly more are coming. This is their video, and then we did this conference, this panel, which was really important. And Mathieu was a part of it. That's why I wanted to bring it up, because he spoke with different scholars and individuals, and also some other people from CATPC, some of the European artists. One, Eleanor Helio, who lives in the Congo, has lived there for a decade at least and works with them. So it was a really interesting conversation between everyone. And I have to say, I mean, the reception of the show was complex. And I'll just say that. In New York, it was, a lot of people were like, yay, this project solves all our problems. And they were like, great news, like this is gonna change the world, it's changed the Congo, like gives back to these people. Some people were afraid, like, what if these people get more capital and then, you know, their friends or like, don't get it, and like it's gonna cause this imbalance, we don't wanna shake this up, you know, and that was really a really interesting reaction, I thought. Like we want to like control who gets what, and you know, like they should stay poor so that there's no imbalance here. That was sort of this, I think, unaware tendency. And then a lot of people were very critical. This is exploitative. It's exploiting these plantation workers who are then turned into artists. Where, you know, this is unethical. So it really kind of stuck between this idea of like good and bad, which I found was to be sort of beyond the point, because this exhibition, this project, this whole endeavor is really about how we're all entrenched in these issues, and we can't get out of it with our hands clean and our consciences clean. And this show's definitely, and this project's definitely not trying to do that, but that doesn't mean we can like, you know, refuse engagement. So what does it mean to engage in a project with people in real time and space and collaboration and all the imbalances that generally creates, you know, with, I guess, people that are seen as other on every side of it. So how do you come together? So here we are on the panel. That's Mathieu in the middle and his translator to the right. So I'll stop now so we can keep talking about it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ruba. Can you hear me? Okay. So I guess before we entered this project, it would be just great to perhaps go back a little bit, because I've been also just thinking about your trajectory before Sculpture Center, with 3 Walls in Chicago, and also your work in Miami. This kind of the sort of independence with which you think and curate, and also, as you mentioned, a sort of feminist position that remains underlining a lot of the works. There's one exhibition that I wanted to mention, which is Dark Continents, which you co-curated.
No, I did that on my
You did it on your own.
It was my very first show that I can barely remember. But
okay. With 8 women artists,
yes.
And just the fact that in this case, there was a looking back, in a sense, of referencing modern art through the moments of Ségogan and to the late 19th century, and looking at the exotic, in a sense, to critique the gaze of the exotic, the male gaze of sort of fetishizing as well the female body, and the way that artists, women artists particularly, have contributed to a kind of ongoing critique of those registers. And perhaps just to share a little bit of that kind of experience as well, because I just feel that while you work very much in the contemporary, there seem to have been referencing constantly of certain tropes from modernism. And also there's the show where you're taking the title from Giacometti's work. So I just think this is just I'm wondering, yeah.
It's something that I feel like I can't remember who said that. Someone said something that was really good about this sort of like this art outside of history. But it's something, I really do place contemporary practices in a historical sphere and try and think not just through art history, but also socio-political contexts. So I really can't divorce art from socio-political context. And with something like Dark Continents, it was looking at primitivism as a art in modern art, but and artists who are not critical of this, but like how can we work with these tropes or these methodologies and like reclaim them in some way. So And that show was, I think it was in 2007 or something. So it was a while ago. It was the first show I ever did at MoCA in Miami, and it was, you know, specific to a place like Miami and some of the ideas that were moving through there. But of course, coming at it from a totally different angle and like speaking historically, like let's consider where we're coming from, or like where these conversations are coming from. A disagreeable object, which references the Giacometti sculpture, was like, everyone's freaking out about new technology in art, but there's been new technology in art for, you know, centuries. So let's look at, you know, I just tend to only go like 100 years back in this research, but it's like the furthest. But let's look at what was happening then. Like, what can we learn? What's instructive for how we can understand some of the issues here, and not, you know, it doesn't have to necessarily be like super critical or dystopian. But I thought, you know, for that show, looking at early 20th century animation, animators were working, you know, this idea of animation, film and animation were not separate, they were together. And this idea of the virtual space was already there with rotoscoping. So all early 20th century cartoons were real live film with like drawings on top of them. So you have like real characters entering into cartoon worlds, cartoons entering into real worlds. So this kind of like fluidity between different dimensions existed in 1913, 1912, 1920. You know, this was like just going on. So, and then it was in the 30s separated out. So that was Disney. Walt Disney like changed everything. And looking at how did our understanding of entertainment generate out of that? How did our understanding of film generate out of that? But also like now we're entering into this new like digital sphere where we're like looking at our phones and entering into this other dimension. How does that relate to these cartoons? And then another, you know, I like to use humor a lot as well. And the film Who Framed Roger Rabbit became a really big point in the show, like a big research point. And it was something that it is like a assessment of this history of film. I don't know if anyone's seen it recently, but it was the first feature-length film that had gave animated characters and live characters full screen time. So it was like another technological feat that was pre-digital. It wasn't digital, but it just anticipated that move. And so looking at some of these examples and then thinking through them through artists who are using like slapstick humor, this Bergsonian idea of this humor coming out of technology. So that was something I really wanted to address, versus just like technology is taking over, technology is like, you know, we're all like post-human, or like a lot of the conversations that are super important, but there are other ways to approach these angles. So that's something that I always am interested in, is like, how do we talk about this from like an unexpected place, perhaps?
Great, and before moving on to our audience, I just had one specific question that I guess has also been troubling me in terms of, since we see also in your exhibitions that sculpture is completely entwined and enmeshed with, say, practices of performance, of video, of text, you know, going from Jumana Mana to someone like, say, Iman Isa or Georgia Sagri, or I mean, there's many, many more also older generation practices that are still, as you said, Teresa Burgami, continuing to circulate extensively. But what happens at times, and this is also present within Documenta 14, there's moments when the performance is absent. There's moments when the performance ruptures the installation or the sculpture. And the audience is, of course, moving in and out of that experience, right? So I'm just trying to think in terms of, say, the Sculpture Center, which is a non-collecting space, a commissioning space, a space for simultaneous exhibitions. How do you, as the curator, kind of navigate through keeping your exhibitions active? Because it isn't possible to keep the performance as something that perhaps is, or maybe sometimes it is, but what happens, you know, when there's sort of this side A, side B kind of scenario where there's moments of absence or void, or, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really a big question. The Eccentrics, for example, you know, I left a space of absence for the, you know, there's this empty space in the middle that where the seating is, people could go sit there and just look at the show, you know, from this angle. And I thought that that was really important, just to note that there is this open space where something could happen. There's this sort of potential there. In terms of the documentation of, I think documentation is really important. I don't think that's been explored so much in terms of how we can work with documentation. You know, my little attempt was making, of course, video documentation of every performance, but then we made a compilation video that I brought, but I don't have time to show. It's on YouTube, you can watch it. But it became another work of the exhibition, basically. It was like gluing together these performances so you know, within a few minutes can get a sense of everything. You know, it became a way to, this video became a way to see, you know, what happened in the space. And Georgia's work, I mean, I told all the artists that, you know, the artists who were making new works, new performances, they were able to fold that into their physical work within the space. So Georgia knew she was doing a performance and she was having an installation. It was her first time ever being invited to do both. She's always invited to do a performance or to do, you know, a static artwork. So she was like excited because she had, you know, she had a space that was not just for a performance, but she could use it for that. And there were all these like crumpled cups and chairs, so it looked like there had been a meeting that was, you know, had just left, you know, just ended. Something had just stopped there. So there was a sort of way that the artist brought that into their works through the conversations we had. So I think like understanding these forms that we're working with and considering them from the beginning will allow us to accommodate them through to the audience, hopefully. And of course, you know, everyone can't see everything. Like Aki Sasamoto's show was very hinged on performance. She had several performances where she was, you know, activating her sculptures, you know, getting into this washer dryer and spinning around. So there's, you know, these were intimate performances. We had 8 or 9 throughout the run of the show. People had to register beforehand. But again, we made like a video for this. We had photographs. It circulated through word of mouth, and she's been able to repeat it in different contexts. But you know, it's always a question, but I think just trying to be as sensitive as possible and like work with the artists to help them convey their work through presence and absence.
Okay, we're going to open up to the audience now. Are there any questions buzzing in the room already? No? Not yet. Ah, there.
Okay. Thank you very much for doing the presentation. I think it's really great that you're here, and to hear a long presentation on something that's not 2D. So I think I didn't know much about your center, so now I know a lot more. So this question is actually around your sources of inspiration, and you know, how do you dream up the kind of things that you do? And I just want to start with what you said earlier. So this sounds like a simple question, but it's actually not a simple question, in that you said, I describe myself I describe my practice as feminist. So I've been to school in London where there were people that introduced themselves to me as I'm feminist or I'm Marxist. And then they turn to me and say, so what are you? And I always say, I'm retired. So these kinds of words like feminist, you know, we don't really, at least I don't hear it very much in Asia. So when you tie that to your sources of inspiration, I mean, what exactly does that mean when you say, I describe my practice as feminist? Because feminist as a discourse has changed a lot, as you know, over time. So it's actually not about women. I mean, some may have started that way, but as you move along, I'm just trying to think how you strategize and how you create, how do you dream up stuff? And as you call yourself feminist, so when you tie those two things together, can you say a little bit more about how you go about strategizing projects?
I mean, I think that I use that term in some slight way as a provocation to place a position and not to just say, I'm a curator who's just doing shows with whoever I think is good and interesting at the moment, you know, and I think there is a position that we're all operating from, and to acknowledge your position is key. You know, I am working in New York, in the US. There's you know, different set of issues there, related and unrelated, but I think for me, I'm operating in a responsive, I try and be as responsive as possible to the context in which I'm working, but also to understand that there are things that are absent, and like there are things that need to be spoken about that aren't spoken about. And I work to identify what's missing. I'm not interested necessarily in repeating what everyone else is doing, and I think in New York at least, that's slightly unusual. And I don't care. Like, I don't care. Like, Arya Rasmussen-Suk's show, an artist in her 50s from Chiang Mai, Thailand, super important artist in Thailand. No one knew her work really in the US. So I was just like, I don't know if people are going to care about this. If, you know, a lot of her work deals with cadavers, animals. It's quite complex. Coming very much from a Thai context. She's also an academic, and she's, you know, the works are slightly also provocative. You know, she's doing meditations with corpses. But I wasn't sure how, and teaching them classes as well in many of her videos, and then doing work with dogs. But I wasn't sure, like, is anyone in New York going to care about this or get it or whatever? But I didn't, you know, that wasn't something that stopped me from doing the show. It just made me think of, how do I frame this? How do I allow people to access this work? You know, and I was surprised because people really loved the show. People were really taken by it. They're really excited. And, you know, because it's great work, but I wasn't deterred because there wasn't already like an audience and interest in this work. I have to like build the audience. So I think when you're working from a position of identifying something that's absent that should come forward, there's a lot more work in terms of helping to make that accessible, understandable, whatever, to different audiences. You know, I'm not Thai. I went to Thailand. I'm not Thai. You know, but I had to find a way to help Arya's work in New York, and I couldn't just slap together some show that was like, here's this artist. I had to really like make it palatable to New York as well, which is like another sort of obligation of working in a local context. You have to somehow like not change it, but understand that your audience is responsive to certain things. So yeah, so it got written up in the New York Times, and it was on all these like top 10 lists in the Guardian, because it was in the end of the year. It was really exciting for her to get that attention that she really deserved. And I think that's why I call my practice feminist. Is just sort of like really a way to talk about, taking those risks with artists from backgrounds, diverse backgrounds and contexts that need to be shown.
It was a really interesting presentation, Ruba, and I'm here really as an artisan to understand the world of curation, because I am totally unexposed to it. And I have two little simple questions. You somewhere mentioned about that you co-curated a show with the artist. So the thought came into my mind that, did you experience an ego conflict over there? Because this word curation is, to me, now becoming more important than the art itself. In my head, that thought is there. Okay, so the fact that you did co-curate, the question came up. It's a simple question, but I'd like you to talk about that. And the other question was that you really went out of your way to bring Matthew from Congo. And as a curator, as a practitioner for art and making exhibitions, where is Matthew now? Has he gone back to Congo? and where does he stand? Because as a person, over the years, I have experienced that a lot of our artisans in this country get a lot of exposure suddenly because they've been picked up and brought into limelight. And then they get lost all over again. And it's really tough because just 3 days ago, I went and visited a terracotta artist here in Calcutta called Ram Kumar Manna, who's really become famous, but is still lying in the wilderness somewhere with the most beautiful terracotta on this earth that I've seen. So that's how that question came up. What do you feel? How do you take this on? Do you feel a sense of responsibility towards the future? Because he's coming from an unknown to an overexposed place. And it really can, you know, push.
So I'll ask your, what? My question. Okay, so I'll answer your second question first. Well, maybe I'll ask your first question. Yes, there's ego problems with that show. Just a short answer for that. We can go back if we have time. But the second question is really important, and I think it's very complicated. And you know, Mathieu came. He had a visa. He stayed for 2 weeks. He was excited to go back home. He has wife, children. You know, he didn't want to stay in New York. He liked it. He also didn't like it. I mean, it was amazing to take him. We took him to the Met Broward to see the Carrie James Marshall show. We took him to see Pende artifacts that, you know, are sitting in the Met that he can't handle. He comes from the Pende region. Of course, the Pende masks that influenced the Surrealists famously. So he had a really interesting trip. I learned not to worry about Mathieu, and that was a lesson I learned because I wanted to be a good host, but then I realized at certain moments, I mean, it was very challenging because he's an adult man who's highly competent and intelligent. You know, he isn't formally educated. He is, but he has this capacity, and I kept running. And I'm not implying that this is what you mean, but you know, I kept running into situations where people were being patronizing, and with good intentions. You know, and so that's something I became very attuned to, and watching that in myself. And Mathieu was fearless and came to New York, and you know, was doing all these new things, totally fine. You know, just was totally fearless, totally precocious. Really didn't seem fazed by it. Where I was like, oh my God, look, you're doing this for the, you know, oh, he went on an escalator for the first time, not to get attached to these weird stories, because it's that's not what it's really about. And then this idea, the critique of this project as exploitative, removes the agency from the plantation worker artists who, you know, this idea that they shouldn't know about contemporary art, or that by, you know, exposing them to it, it's somehow transforming them for the worse, or once they go to New York, how are they going to go back to the village? You know, these ideas are really complicated, and it's not. There's a lot of assumptions that go into that I feel are important to interrogate. So CATPC is a project. The funds go back. It's improving the quality of life. There's more resources. It's gearing towards a more sustainable life in the Congo for this group of people. So that's also, there's a limitation there as well. They have to be artists part of this. It's not for everyone, although it does sort of trickle out a little bit. And there are ideas that maybe this can grow, but at the moment it is, for this group of artists that are producing works, and they don't have capital. So you can't, the entire country, especially the rural areas, are, being exploited, extracted, invested into, but the local people don't have the capital to do it themselves. So this allows them to start building these gardens, building their own plantation, a post-plantation model. But, so hopefully this will last, but yeah, there's no guarantee. There's no guarantee that the works will sell. I mean, it's kind of difficult to sell them. That's where the European partners come in, because they do a lot of fundraising outside of the commercial sale of the works to help make this possible. But, it's not like it's a way of redistributing capital of the art, art capital, but there's no way to ensure that the continued success of this project. And that's just, but I don't know if that means it shouldn't be done. So there was also another idea, like people were sort of like, well, this can't last, so should it even be done? And I don't know if we can say like, it's not worth it, or it is worth it, because there's no, the harm is more to our like perception of guilt. I think at least in the U.S. it was like there was this perception of like, oh, we don't want to like, there's too much guilt involved in trying to like create change that we can't control the future of. So we shouldn't do it at all. And I think that's like it's a real question that should not, we should keep thinking about, but I don't have the answer to that, and I don't think it's, it means that it shouldn't be done.
Just to help you answer this from the point of view of my experience in my work in the last 20 years has been with artisans all over the world. And if it helps to settle your dilemmas, from the artisan's point of view, the depth of their maturity and the way that they're centered in their native knowledge, 2 weeks of displacement really doesn't do as much as it does to the viewer in the West.
Exactly.
And
exactly.
They look at this like another opportunity, another way to locate their practice, another way to earn money. And I think it does much, much more help to that artisan when he brings back the best practices that he sees, and especially the kind of respect that hand labor gets in the West, unlike in the countries where they exist. That really kind of invigorates that practice when they come back home.
Well, and just to add quickly to that, Mathieu was taking a lot of photographs and video to share back to his, the other artists that couldn't travel. So he was reporting, he was coming to participate as much as he was coming to report back. So, first time outside of Lusanga. So, yeah, very first time.
I really appreciate your presentation, and I wanted to go back to the feminist
yes.
Identification, because I think there's a lot to unpack in there in your curatorial practice, and I really appreciate that. What I feel, and I would like you to comment on this, but I think there's a redistribution of power that I think you're identifying with the feminist practice, and you're applying it on all things, like not gender related. And that's a very important aspect as a methodology of looking at, from a political perspective to an institutional way to a curatorial way. And then browsing through the many images, but I think there's a form that's developing, which I think, I don't know, I want to ask you, are you realizing that you're also kind of breaking the sculpture? Like there's something about the softness in the sculpture that you're seeking out. And the last thing is, especially that you ended with CATPC's work about giving back and usability. So where does the sculpture stop being that which we look at into something that actually has an economy of giving back and becoming something of use, which is, for me, is where I'm very invested in at this point.
I will try to answer or respond to this question, but thank you for those comments, because it's hard to sometimes see what you're doing. So it was nice to I feel like that's a really nice way of putting it, and I really appreciate that. But yeah, I think there's something about instability, like when you brought that up, that there or usability, you said, and then I wrote instability, but I think there's something there that I really am interested in, and yeah, redistributions of power, but also that things are not fixed. Histories are shifting, use is shifting, cultural, social, political relationships are constantly in flux. So I really do have this sort of, yeah, I do put things in motion in some way. through the shows I'm doing. And I don't, I can maybe articulate a few examples of that, but I think maybe you hopefully saw that there's things are in motion, things are in play. Very little is like static. And even the CATPC show, it was put in sort of a classical, like if you were walking into a historical museum and looking in the classical display of these sculptures, there was a play on that in some way, but it was also like the easiest way to put them in this space, so there was something practical, but showing the repeated versions is also breaking this idea of this like singular object. And they're quite powerful in person. I hate showing images of them. I mean, I think you can get it, but the material, the smell, you see the gradation of the 3D model within this chocolate sculpture. It looks like it's been carved out of wood or something, but then you realize it's actually like this digital form through like a very handmade, it's made in mud initially. So you're like mud plus like the digital, like combined in this object. It's quite powerful. And then seeing multiple of them, they are fetishes. They are embedded with power. Mathieu saw them. It was like he was seeing his friends because he knew the people who made them. There's sort of this investment, which I think, I'm not afraid, we shouldn't be afraid to talk about that as like something that is a part of their practice as contemporary artists. Like artisans, kind of, but really they are trying, they're working as contemporary artists and they're working in this context. So it's like there is this acknowledgement of the places in which these works are circulating. So I think there is this instability that I'm really interested in. Of course, they melt. Just with this show, they melt. A lot of the works I show are like, like Rochelle Goldberg. Her materials are crude oil, chia seeds, ceramics, steel, fiber optic cables. So it's really like, materials that have histories and current usage that is significant to consider. It's not just like, you can't take it for granted as an object. So I think hopefully that speaks to what you were saying, but that's something I really find important in terms of, all art media, but, being in Sculpture Center, that is like a sort of frame for this work so far.
Ruba, if I may, just as a kind of a closing, but also taking off from what you and Reem has said, I'd like to kind of point out one thing, which is that this project, the way that you talked about it, the CATPC, and the way that perhaps another institution or another set of curators would frame it is very, very different. And I'd just like to highlight that for this audience, because I personally observed that there have been multiple instances since this project was initiated that it would be called Renzo Martin's project, and his name would be recalled a number of times. This is an inversion of that, and I think that's something to understand, because I have personal kind of opinion around this particular European artist practice, Renzo Martin's, and what his video work has meant, which is also, in my eyes, a certain kind of fetishization of a certain realm of poverty and of continuing colonial relationships. And yet this is another kind of format that has been initiated as a collaborative format, in which perhaps there's a lot of reassessment of earlier work. But I just really think that the questions that have come up have been very, very relevant, and I fully appreciate your responsibility in how you have framed this project at the level of the exhibition, at the level of talking about Mathieu's experience, and really I hope that there is this question of sustainability of such a project can be followed up, can be also reassessed within forums like this, because otherwise there's a very skewed kind of way that such projects are made into once again a kind of commodity within the art world that we operate in.
I want to speak to that super quickly because I know we're really out of time, but I feel like I have to thank you for saying that. And I think also, I don't want to obscure the fact that Renzo Martins is like a big persona who does, bring a lot to this work that's complicated, but he was open to this, so I think he wanted it also to be presented like this. He has his like personality and his approach, but this has become more than him, and he supports that and wants it to be like this, and it's possible. So I think a lot of it is like the expectation that others bring to it, or the way that press kept attaching to Renzo, and it's like, it's not just him. Writers about the show wrote out Mathieu completely, like a review of the exhibition, talked about the conference, mentioned Renzo, all these star-studded speakers, and then did not mention that Mathieu was there speaking on several panels. So you're like, this is just, it's the way of defining a story that's very complicated, and where many people are drawn to framing things in a certain way, and we're responsible for how we respond to these works as well. And there are many ways to enter into it and think about it, and it's not just like this sort of celebrity Euro artist that needs to come to the fore. So, but he's definitely like there. He's not. It's complicated because of that. And doing the show took on that risk, and intentionally embarked on this journey, knowing that there was like controversy around it. But how can we let this other side of the project rise and figure out how to frame it in a different way? So there's a couple shows of this work before, and it was Renzo Martins. The language wasn't there. The display, the way of displaying the works wasn't there, and I wanted to do this to help them think through these questions and allow them to figure out how to make the show in the way that best reflected what this project was, which the previous examples I didn't think did that actually, but I believed, and I saw those sculptures, I saw the work, the drawings, they're incredible. So I was like, this, it's worth it to try this out. So
thank you so much.